Hello everyone, today I'm going to show you how to measure your ride height on your 1/12 scale vehicle. Now, a lot of people will just casually measure the ride height at the front, in the middle, and the back. Well, as you know in some of my previous videos, you need to be perfect in everything you do when it comes to 1/12 scale. You can't just casually measure the ride height and say, I'm pretty sure it's 3.4 millimeters on the front and 3.4 in the rear. You have to be absolutely accurate with measuring your ride height. This is another important tuning feature for your 1/12 scale vehicle. Now, before you go into measuring the ride height, one thing you have to understand is you want to make sure that your 1/12 scale vehicle is race ready. And what I mean by that is, number one, your 1/12 scale main chassis here has been balanced left and right. Now, I did a video on how to balance the chassis left and right, but you want to make sure that it's balanced left and right. Number two, you want to make sure that your front springs are either new or in good condition. You don't want to have any springs that are collapsed because that will definitely affect the ride height measurements. And number three, you want to make sure that your tires, yes, your tires have to be trued evenly, left to right. It doesn't matter what the size is, front to rear. Obviously, your car has to be race ready, so whatever tires you use for your race or for your practice session, you want to make sure that they're true to the dimensions that you want and that they're even left and right. Okay, so once you get those three things sorted out, you're pretty much good to go to measure your ride height. Now, I like to measure my ride height at eight different points on my car. Now, the reason why I do this is I'm checking for more than just the ride height. I'm checking to see if there's any issues going on with the car suspension, with the chassis, or the rear pod. Checking the ride height is more than just actually checking the ride height. I'm checking to see whether or not there's any other issues that are coming up with the car suspension or with the rear pod. So the 8 points are here, here, where the side link is, here, and right there. Okay, probably get the gist of it here. And where the rear pod is, where the link connects to the rear pod, I'll measure there, and I'll measure the opposite side there. And then, excuse me, I'm just going to turn the car around. I like to measure the ride height at this point here and this point here. Now, when it comes to measuring the ride height at this point here and this point here, this is helping me to identify if there is any tweak going on in the rear pod assembly. I do this especially if I've had a hard crash. First thing I'll do is I'll measure at this point here and this point here. This will, what will usually happen is I will measure the ride height on this side here and say, oh, okay, well, that's about 3.4. Let's see here, 3.4. Oh, well, let's just flip it up to the other side here. Okay, so it's 3.4 left and right. So since I measured 3.4, I know the pod is perfectly fine as long as the tires are nice and trued and race ready. But if the pod is measuring, say, 3.4 and 3.3, I know the pod is tweaked. So what I need to do is loosen off the screws, reset the pod, and there we go. And, at the front area here where the side links connect to of the rear pod, that can also be an indicator whether or not the rear pod is tweaked. If you do have a ride height difference on this side here versus this side, that means the pod might be tweaked a little bit. All right, so you would have to go ahead and reset it. When I actually measure my ride height for the rear pod, I like to measure it, for example, 3.4 millimeters at the back and 3.4 millimeters at the front of the pod here. So it's just pretty much nice and flat. And as you start to move towards the front of the car, I like to have a bit of a difference of about maybe 0.2 of a millimeter coming from the back to the front. So if I was to say that this area here is 3.4 millimeters, I want to have the front around 3.2. That's just my personal preference and how I like to set up my cars. So that brings the weight a little bit forward on the wheels. Now, if I was to measure the ride height on the front suspension, I find that this side here is 3.2 millimeters, and on the other side here it's 3 millimeters. That is a cause of concern. That might be A, the lower suspension arm has been tweaked, which you'll need to unscrew and reset. B, the actual spring has collapsed and you need to replace it with a new one. And that's pretty much it. Or even if you did have a hard accident, it could be that you might just have to loosen off these screws here to relax the chassis back to its original position, and that could just be it for the front end. So there's a few things that you need to look at if the ride height is different from here to here. If your ride height is different from here to here, it could just be that the balance of the chassis isn't balanced left to right. But a lot of the times you don't really see much of a change in ride height from this point here to here. I would just keep your attention on the front end, the rear, and the center pod area, or the rear pod front area. Okay, so that's pretty much it. Definitely pick up a Yokomo ride height gauge with fine increments. It definitely makes a difference. And like I said, with anything with dealing with 1/12 scales, you have to be perfect if you want to have a perfect car out on the track.